part 3. And the topic is the role of the substance abuse professional in relation to the return to duty process. I'm doing my first YouTube course, and it's going to be 4 parts, 4 videos that I'm going to create my YouTube course in relation to the role of the substance abuse professional in relation to the return to duty process. So this is part 3 or 4 parts. Check out my introduction to this course. Check out my part 1 and my part 2 to this course. And this is part 3. This is valuable information. I'm really excited to be able to do this. So part 3, I'm going to share with the viewer a sample return to duty process case file. These are clear sample forms. These forms are part of my policy and procedure. And like I said, I'm just going to give an overview in this to kind of give the viewer some insight on the clinical piece that comes into play. So one of the documents that here is an actual sample client DOT file with all of my forms in here. You know, it's got the intake section of the sample file with all of my forms in it. And I'm gonna kind of like give a overview of a sample client file. But so you can kind of get an idea in terms of all of the work that goes behind the role of the substance abuse professional when we get down to the clinical piece. But one of the documents that's in this file is one of the actual documents that I go over when I have clients in front of me is the Statement of Understanding Informed Consent. From a clinical standpoint, I have to present and go over that document, a statement of understanding, meaning informed consent in terms of what that services involved, go over that document, informed consent, talking about all of the processes that's going to take place. So that's the actual document. Another powerful document in that file would be the SAP DOT Independent Contractual Agreement. Most important thing, I'm going to enter into a contractual agreement with that client. In that contractual agreement, it's going to clearly outline my role as the DOT-qualified substance abuse professional, all of the particulars I got to do behind the scenes to do that assessment, evaluation, level of care recommendation, guide that process in regards to that violator becoming eligible to return back to the safety sensitive position. So you got to have that contractual agreement in place. It's going to talk about my fees, you know, what I'm going to do, the responsibility of that client, all laid out in that contract. Well, I'm going to review that contract with that client. That we're going to both parties are going to sign. I get a copy, the client get a copy. I tell anyone, you in any type of work, you got to enter into a contractual agreement, and that also protects that SAP, and it also protects the everything that I do as a DOT qualified substance abuse professional. That's going to protect what I do. It's going to protect my license and everything. Of course, there's the intake form. You know, that's standard, getting all of the basic demographics. So intake form is going to be a part of that client file. Case management, consultation, service notes. You know, everything I do is documented. You know, I'm going to document that first appointment. I'm going to document when I have to refer that person out. So you got to have that case notes documentation, which will be a part of that client file. The initial SAP evaluation report is also a part of that clinical file. After I do my thorough, comprehensive clinical assessment, I'm going to generate a report. That's going to become a part of the file. There's certain information that I have to put into the clearinghouse database in terms of the date that first evaluation, that date that initial evaluation was completed. That information will be entered into the clearinghouse. So that's how DOT can track FMCSA transportation mode. That's how they can pull up that database and see the date that client had that initial assessment. Follow-up SAP evaluation report, success of compliance. That's another document that's going to go in there. Also, when I do my follow-up testing plan, that's another document. All that's going to be a part of my file. Evidence that that was done. The follow-up testing plan, the employer will only see that, not the employee. And like I said, this is just kind of like an overview of all of the forms and documents that becomes a part of this client file. In the event the client does not comply to my recommendation, I will do a non-successful compliance report. That report will become a part of the file. That client will get a copy of that report. And if there's an employer involved at that stage of the game, that employer will also get a copy of that non-compliance report. The SAP DOT Treatment Plan, you know, when I do that initial thorough clinical evaluation, that substance abuse evaluation, that's going to set the stage for me to go in and develop a treatment plan, a clinical treatment plan in collaboration with that client. And prior to that client leaving to my first appointment, that client is going to also get a copy of that treatment plan, so he or she can know exactly what has been recommended and what they got to do in order to get into compliance. So that treatment plan, that clinical treatment plan, is a part of this client file. Also, a part of the client case file, consent for release of confidential information in the event if that client want a individual who's not a service agent to get a copy of their recommendation. Say, for example, if it's a parole officer or probation officer or their primary doctor, anyone who's not a DOT service agent, I will have them assign a consent or release of information in relation to their level of care recommendation. In that release, it'll be specific information. Don't mean they get in the whole file. No, in that consent to release the information, it's going to specify specifically what information will be released. Also, a part of that case file will be a spiritual needs screener. Also, a part of that case file will be a mental health screening form. Also, a part of that case file will be the Addiction Severity Index, which is a clinical tool that I use as a licensed clinical addiction expert to gather information in many of that client life areas in order to formulate my level of care recommendation. And that will have to be done prior to the end of that first appointment. Also, a part of that clinical file will be a criteria for substance use disorder, past substance use questionnaire, the completed full evaluation report will also be a part of that file. Also will be a part of that file is the SAP DOT return to duty referral form, because once I complete that assessment and make a level of care recommendation, I'm also going to have a copy of who I referred that client to go in terms of getting the education or treatment that they're going to need based off my recommendation. Also, a part of that file will be follow-up appointments, documentation of the follow-up appointments and deadline to complete the recommendation. All of that will be a part of that file. And on that appointment, there's another assessment I do in terms of measuring their progress at that follow-up appointment to ensure that they complied to my initial recommendation. I also may have copies of self-help meeting verification forms in that file. So again, this here is just a kind of overview of the many of the various forms. Like I say, this is literally a sample case files or all of my clear forms in relation to the SAP DOT return to duty process. This is the clinical piece. This is the clinical piece that comes into play in terms of the knowledge I have to do a thorough substance abuse clinical evaluation, assessment, and level of care recommendation, and having the licensure and credential to clinically assess that client in front of me in order to determine what level of recommendation assistance they're going to need, whether it's treatment or going into an outpatient program or detox. That's the purpose of the thorough substance abuse clinical evaluation and level of care recommendation. That's where that clinical piece comes in, and that ties into the role and function. Oh, sorry, my allergies are killing me. That ties into the role and function of a qualified DOT evaluator is to thoroughly assess that client and to appropriately recommend them to the level of care based off that assessment. Real talk. So again, like I said, this is just a thorough list right here of all of the clinical forms that becomes a part of that file. Right there. It's a lot of information. That's that clinical piece is the biggest piece in regards to what that DOT qualified substance abuse professional does. So again, like I said, this is part 3 or part 4 of the role of the substance abuse professional in relation to the return to duty process. Check out my introduction to this course. Check out part 1 and part 2 to this course. This is part 3 to this course, and there's going to be a part 4, so be on the lookout for part 4 of the SAP DOT return to duty process. The role of the substance abuse professional in relation to the DOT return to duty process. So that's all I have. Simple fast, simple fidelis, and I'm going to leave you in the care of your own conscience. Have a great day.